Throughout history, humans have told stories of giants. Ancient myths describe enormous beings battling the gods. Religious texts speak of powerful people who tower over ordinary humans. And in the 19th century, newspapers ran wild with the discoveries of giant bodies being unearthed. At first glance, many of these stories seem to be legends or overly exaggerated, but what makes the giants so fascinating is how they appear across a myriad of cultures and time periods. From the myths of the ancient Greeks and Scandinavians, to indigenous folklore in Northern America, to strange archaeological discoveries that still spark debate to this day, the idea of giant beings appear again and again and again throughout history. So where did giant stories come from? Were giants simply mythological creatures created to explain the unknown? Or were they inspired by unusually tall humans and misunderstood fossils? Or could some of these stories be based on something real? In this video, we're going to take a look at several famous stories and historical claims involving giants. We'll look at the evidence behind them, the information that's being proposed, and explore why the legend of the giants has survived for thousands of years. And we'll start with one of the oldest giant stories in human history, the giants of ancient Greek mythology. One of the most famous and earliest stories about giants comes from Greek mythology. According to Greek legend, there once existed a powerful race of beings called giants, or gigantes, who were said to be enormous in size and incredibly strong. These giants are said to have threatened the gods themselves in battle and threatened the order of the universe. Greek legends describe this battle as the Gigantomachy, a legendary war between the giants and the Olympian gods. According to myths, giants were born of the blood of the sun god Uranus after he was defeated by his son Kronos. These giants eventually rose up against the gods of Mount Olympus in an attempt to overthrow them. Ancient sources sometimes describe these giants as enormous, terrifying beings with large bodies and serpents for legs. Greek art and poetry frequently shows depictions of these beings fighting with the Olympian gods. In the end, the Olympian gods, led by Zeus, were only able to defeat the giants with the help of their legendary hero, Hercules. Today, historians generally interpret these stories to mythology rather than historical accounts, and many scholars believe that the giants in Greek mythology represent chaos or untamed forces of nature that the gods represent overcoming. Others suggest that stories like these may have stemmed from the discovery of prehistoric bones and fossils during ancient times. Without modern scientific knowledge, it is possible that ancient people would have stumbled across these bones and imagined them belonging to giant humans. Whatever the origin, the myth of giants in Greek mythology has become one of the most well-known throughout the world today. But Greek mythology wasn't the only culture to discuss giants. In the myths of Northern Europe, giants weren't just the enemies of gods, but they were some of the oldest creatures in existence. While Greek mythology presents giants as the enemies of gods, in Norse mythology giants actually play a much more complicated role. In Norse mythology, giants known as the Jötnar were not just monsters to be defeated. In many stories, these beings were some of the most powerful and intimidating in existence, and in some cases were even related to the gods themselves. According to Norse creation myths, the world began with a giant. The primordial giant was called Ymir. Norse mythology describes Ymir as the first ever living being, born from the meeting of fire and ice in the empty void that existed long before the world. Eventually the gods killed Ymir and used his body to create the earth. His flesh became the earth, his blood became the oceans, and his bones formed the mountains. But giants continued to appear throughout Norse mythology. The thunder god Thor is often depicted as travelling to these distant lands to fight giants in various myths. But interestingly, not all giants were enemies. Some gods were even said to have giant ancestry, suggesting that the relationship between gods and giants was a lot more complex than good versus evil. Today, historians generally interpret Norse giants as wild and dangerous forces of nature, something like ice, wind, mountains, and untamed wilderness. The stories often reflect the harsh conditions of Scandinavia, where survival depended on overcoming powerful natural forces. But the idea of giants wasn't limited to European mythology. In some cases, people have suggested that ancient civilizations may have seen the gods themselves as giants. One example that sometimes comes up in this debate is the ancient Egyptians. Some researchers and writers have suggested that ancient depictions of gods might actually hint towards the belief that they were giant beings. One civilization that is usually discussed in this context is ancient Egypt. While Egyptian mythology doesn't directly claim that there are giants in the same way that Greek and Norse mythology do, some modern interpretations lead people to believe that the gods were significantly physically much larger than humans. Ancient Egyptian art often depicts the gods towering over the humans. Deities such as Ra and Osiris are frequently depicted as much larger than the people around them in temple carvings and wall paintings. In many scenes, the gods are pictured as dramatically taller than the pharaohs and the other people around them. To some modern observers, the difference in scale has raised the question of whether these images could represent beings that are believed to be physically enormous. Because of this, a few alternative interpretations have suggested that the ancient Egyptians may have imagined their gods as giant beings that interacted directly with humanity. However, most Egyptologists agree that these images were not meant to represent literal size. Instead, Egyptian art commonly uses something called the hierarchical scale, a technique where most important figures were drawn physically larger than those below them to represent power or divine status. The artistic convention is used throughout ancient Egyptian art and is used to convey the importance of the gods and rulers. Even so, the idea of powerful beings walking among humans is still continually represented throughout the world. And in some cultures, these stories don't just describe gods and mythological creatures, but actually depict giants as things that used to walk alongside humans. Some of the most intriguing stories about giants come from the indigenous traditions in North America. One of the most well-known examples of this come from the northern Paiute people of Nevada, who tell stories about mysterious groups of beings known as the Si-Te-Cah. According to Paiute oral tradition, the Si-Te-Cah were a group of large and powerful individuals who lived long ago and were hostile towards local tribes. The stories describe the Si-Te-Cah as tall, powerful, and sometimes to have reddish hair. According to the legend, conflict broke out between them and neighbouring tribes. One version of the story is that the Si-Te-Cah fled to a cave in what is now known as Nevada. The tribe supposedly trapped them inside and set fire to the entrance, ending the conflict. This story is often connected to a real archaeological site called Lovelock Cave. In the early 20th century, miners and archaeologists excavated the cave and discovered a large amount of artifacts and ancient human remains. Among the discovery were tools, blankets, and ancient remains dating back thousands of years. Some reports from the early excavations actually mentioned unusually tall skeletons and reddish hair that had been preserved with the remains. These details led some people to speculate that discoveries might really be connected with the Paiute people and the legends of the Si-Te-Cah. However, most archaeologists believe that the remains in Lovelock Cave belong to regular humans who just lived on the land years ago. The reddish hair seen on some of the mummies is now believed to be a common effect of aging and environmental conditions that can sometimes turn dark hair reddish over time. Researchers generally interpret the Paiute stories as rich oral tradition rather than literal historical accounts of giants. Still, the connection between the folklore and actual archaeological discoveries keeps the legend alive and continues to spark debate and curiosity to this day. And Lovelock Cave wasn't the only place where people claimed to have found unusually large human remains. During the 19th and early 20th century, newspapers across North America were filled with reports of giant skeletons being uncovered in the burial mounds and excavation sites. Some of these discoveries were explained or debunked, but others remain difficult to verify. By the 19th century, stories about giant discoveries were no longer just linked to myths and folklore. Newspapers across North America began to publish reports that a giant skeleton had been found during excavations. Many of these discoveries were said to have taken place during digging wells, building railroads, or excavating ancient burial grounds. One region where these stories appeared frequently was the Ohio Valley, where large earthen burial grounds built by ancient indigenous cultures were being excavated throughout the 1800s. Several news articles at the time reported skeletons 7 to 9 feet tall being discovered within these mounds. Some accounts even described unusually large skulls or bones that appeared much larger than that of the average person. These discoveries were sometimes linked to theories that a lost giant race once lived in North America. In other cases, people speculated that the giants might be linked to ancient stories beings, like the giants mentioned in the Book of Genesis. Because archaeology was a relatively new science at the time, these discoveries were poorly documented. Some remains were lost, reburied, or simply never studied in detail, making it very difficult to verify the reports today. Most historians and archaeologists believe that the reports were likely exaggerated or simply misunderstood. In some cases, skeletons may have appeared larger than normal simply because they were incomplete or incorrectly measured. In other cases, newspaper stories may have been sensationalized to attract readers during a time when strange discoveries often captured the imagination. Still, the idea that giant skeletons were being discovered beneath the ground captured the public. And in the late 1800s, that fascination led to one of the most famous giant discoveries in American history. In 1869, workers building a well seemed to discover the petrified body of a massive human figure buried underground. The discovery would soon be known as the Cardiff Giant. In October of 1969, workers digging a well in New York made an astonishing discovery. Just beneath the soil, they uncovered what seemed to be the body of a massive human figure. The figure measured 10 feet long and seemed to be the petrified remains of a giant human. The discovery quickly became known as the Cardiff Giant, and the news spread quickly across the United States. Thousands of curious visitors travelled to see the giant with their own eyes. The figure remained ancient and weathered, and many people believed they were looking at the fossilized remains of a giant from the ancient past. Some religious figures even suggested this might be evidence of the ancient giants depicted in the Book of Genesis. Experts at the time disagreed about what the giant could truly be. Some argued that it was the petrified remains of a giant, and some argued that it was simply a statue from ancient times. The excitement around the discovery became so intense that at one point the famous P.T. Barnum even tried to buy the figure to put it on display for the public. But the mystery didn't last very long. Investigators eventually discovered that the giant had been intentionally carved from a large block of gypsum and buried underground as part of an elaborate hoax. The entire event had been orchestrated by a man called George Hull, who reportedly created the fake giant to prove that people would believe anything if it was mysterious enough. Now, I think that's really funny, but it's probably morally wrong. What many people thought was a petrified body of an ancient giant actually was just a carefully crafted statue. The Cardiff Giant became one of the most famous archaeological hoaxes in history, but the stories about giants didn't stop after that. Even today, people continue to claim that giant skeletons are being found all over the world. So if giants were never really real, where are all these stories coming from? To answer that question, we're going to have a look at some scientific explanations that might help us understand where these legends came from. By the early 20th century, archaeology and paleontology had developed into far more rigorous sciences. As researchers began to investigate giant stories more carefully, several explanations emerged that account for the majority of these discoveries. One possible explanation involved fossils. Long before modern science existed, people were discovering large ancient bones in the ground. Without knowledge of prehistoric animals, these bones had been interpreted as belonging to giant human beings. In reality, many of these bones probably belonged to mammoths or other prehistoric animals. Another factor may have been a simple measuring error. Early archaeological excavations were not always conducted with the careful methods we use today. Skeletons that were incomplete or poorly preserved could easily appear larger than they actually were, especially if the bones were misaligned or estimated incorrectly. Sensationalized newspaper reports may have also played a role. During the 19th century, newspapers often competed for readers by publishing outrageous and dramatic stories. Reports of giant skeleton discoveries would attract enormous attention, so details were sometimes exaggerated or poorly verified. Finally, there are rare medical conditions that can cause a person to grow to extraordinary heights. One example is gigantism, which occurs when the body produces too many growth hormones during early childhood. Individuals with this condition grow well over 7 foot tall and sometimes, in rare cases, even larger. Throughout history, encounters with larger individuals may have inspired the stories behind giants. Taken together, these examples help account for many of the stories and discoveries connected to giants. Fossils, measurement errors, exaggerated reports, and rare medical conditions all provide possible ways that the legends of giants have developed over time. Stories about giants appear in cultures across the world, many of which never had any interaction with one another. From ancient mythology to indigenous folklore, the idea of giants seems to have captured the human imagination for thousands of years, which raises an interesting possibility. Even if giants never existed in in the way that legend describes them. There may be deeper reasons why so many cultures told these stories in the first place, and that brings us back to the bigger mystery of the legend of giants. So after looking at ancient myths, cultural legends, historical discoveries, and scientific explanations, the mystery of giants is still an interesting one. As we discussed, in many cases, the mystery of giants can be explained by misunderstood fossils, exaggerated reports, or rare conditions like gigantism. Hoaxes like the Cardiff Giant also show how we as people get wrapped up in mysteries and legends. But even with all those explanations, the question still remains: why do so many cultures around the world have stories of giants? From the giants of Greek mythology to the Norse Jötnar to the Si-Te-Cah, these stories have been passed down for thousands of years. Maybe giants were simply powerful symbols used to explain the unknown. Maybe they were inspired by encounters with unusually tall individuals. Or maybe the real origins of these stories has simply been lost to time. Either way, the legends of giants continue to capture our imagination, even today. And I'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever heard any stories about giants where you live? Do you know of any historical discoveries, local legends, or strange reports involving giant skeletons? If you do, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And if you enjoy exploring strange history, mysterious legends, and unexplained stories like this, consider liking the video and subscribing, because there'll be plenty more content like this on the channel. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.